This is The Meaningful Way. I'm your host, Luke Iorio. Hey there, everyone. I want to thank you for tuning into The Meaningful Way today. I've been very much looking forward to this show because we are going to tackle some big questions today. We're going to take a look at the mind. We're going to distinguish the difference between the mind and the brain. And we're going to talk about how does this all relate to who are we, so that we can tie it into our everyday lives and how it is that we bring about more meaning and live with more purpose and potential in our lives. And so today we have a very special guest in Dr. Daniel Siegel. Dr. Siegel is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine. He is the founding co-director of UCLA's Mindful Awareness Research Center. He's the founding co-investigator of the UCLA Center for Culture, Brain and Development and executive director at the Mindsight Institute, an educational center devoted to promoting insight, compassion, and empathy in individuals, families, institutions, and communities. He has been invited to lecture for the King of Thailand, Pope John Paul II, His Holiness The Dalai Lama, Google University, and TEDx. And today we dive into his work as well as his latest book, Mind, A Journey to the Heart of Being Human. Welcome, Dr. Siegel. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Luke.
So I have to just begin with this, because the field that you are in is not one that many would check off on the career day box. I've got to ask, how did you find your way into this incredible field and then being a pioneer in this field of both not just neurobiology, but I believe as you would term it, interpersonal neurobiology?
Right. Well, I started out in biology as a college student, went to medical school, and found myself very disillusioned with the way I was being taught to be a physician. So I stopped school for a while. When I came back, I really was struggling with this issue that our relationships and the way we focus on each other's subjective experience, what you call the interpersonal world, was really important, yet it was ignored in medicine. So I saw these really bright professors of the body who were somehow missing something about our connections with each other and even our internal mental lives. So when I went into pediatrics and switched over to psychiatry and then became a researcher in psychiatry, I really wanted to bring my background as a science-trained person, as a scientist, into clinical practice, and there wasn't anything really doing that. So I brought a bunch of academics together, and ultimately that gave birth to this field you're talking about, interpersonal neurobiology. And now we have a whole bunch of books out for people to read on this subject, and it's an exciting time for sure.
So what specifically is the focus of interpersonal neurobiology, and what is it meant to teach us and connect us to?
So its function is to say, if you brought all the fields of science together into one framework, could that help us understand being human? Could it help us understand the human mind and what a healthy mind is? Could it help us illuminate paths to well-being that perhaps we wouldn't have thought of before, or we can understand the ones that we've figured out in more depth and detail? So it's really a way to bring math and physics and chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, linguistics, anthropology, all those fields, and put them into one frame to ask, who are we and how can we bring more well-being into our lives?
So I very much would we will get to that question, but I guess you could say to lead into it, one of the things in your latest book that you spend some time distinguishing and defining and helping us understand is what is the mind and how does that differ from the brain? Because I think that's something that even in my own learning and growth and consciousness and everything else, it's something we struggle with, is this idea that the brain and the mind are somehow separate. They serve different functions. And I'm curious if you could illuminate some of that conversation for us.
Absolutely. Well, historically, since the time of Hippocrates 2,500 years ago, it's been said that the mind and all its joys and sorrows are only a product of the brain. And this has been reaffirmed by the father of modern psychology, William James. And in fact, it might just be true. But the word mind is usually meant to indicate our feelings and our thoughts, things like our memories, the things that have meaning in our lives. So meaning, for your broadcast here, is exactly what the mind is all about. So for me, trained as a biologist, I know the body's important in our lives. I know the brain as part of the body is really interesting and really important. But I just wondered if subjective experience, like meaning making, the stories we tell, the feelings we have, the memories that fill us, if those aspects of mind, what people pretty much agree what the word mind refers to, and consciousness that lets us be aware of them, is that just brain activity, or is it something more? And so that's been a kind of obsession I've had in my mind, for many decades now. And I come to the scientific view that what scientists have been saying for thousands of years may actually be a limited story that's actually not so good for us to believe as the totality of the story. So that's why I wrote the book Mind, to say, well, what might the mind be if it's beyond brain activity? Not excluding it, but saying it's not limited to it, something beyond it, something also.
There were two phrases in there as you were explaining that, in terms of our subjective reality as well as meaning making. And I was looking for, can you expand a little bit on those and help our listeners kind of understand the context of those, and then the relevancy of that to our everyday lives?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, personally, I first, learned about this as an adolescent when I was in college, and, I was trained to work on a suicide prevention service. And, we were taught that when a person in crisis who's considering ending their life calls and you're on the other end of the line, the way you tune into what has meaning for them, and the way you tune into what their inner life is like, their feelings, the tone of their state of mind, what they're thinking about, as well as the stories that embed their beliefs and their hope for the future or lack of it. Whether you tune into that or not makes the difference between whether they live or not. So for me, the word subjective experience wasn't made less, even though I was trained to be an objective scientist. To me, it taught me that, subjective life, meaning making, stories, memory, thoughts, feelings, all that is not observable by another person. You can't, even if you're a fantastic poet or songwriter, you can never really let another person know exactly what your subjective life is like. It's just the amazing thing about having a mind. So even though it's not able to be studied with numbers, and hence we call it subjective, it's really important. So then when I was in medical school, and the physicians that were teaching me paid no attention to it, they could tell a person, hey, I have your lab tests and it looks like you'll be dying in 3 months, goodbye. I literally would tug on their coat and say, don't you want to go back and talk to them about how they feel? They go, why? I said, well, because there's a meaning to the thing you just said to them. They go, that's not my job. So when I dropped out of school and ultimately decided to come back, I made up this word mindsight for what these professors lacked, and had to really study them, because we now know, that if you go to a physician, even for a common cold, and they identify your feelings, like they say, oh, Luke, it must be so frustrating. You have a cold. You have a big podcast coming up. Just by saying it must be frustrating for you, rather than just telling you what to do, you'll get over your cold a day sooner, and your immune function will be bolstered in a positive way by that empathic comment from the physician.
So it's that ability, and as you described before, of getting some recognition as well as resonance to the inner world of the other person. That's where that mindsight, as you described, that empathy is able to come through in the acknowledgement and validation of what it seems like they are experiencing at that moment, and that's going to create a very different level of connection between individuals. That's where the interpersonal takes on a completely different level in what I'm hearing.
Exactly. And that's a skill, you can teach people to have. It's a skill when kids are focused too much on their gadgets and not on each other. I fear that they're not developing well. Mm-hmm. So, as we go forward, keeping in mind that Mindsight is a learnable skill, and if you don't get the experiences to learn it, you actually will have a deficient amount of it, which is probably in part what my professors were experiencing. And, it's not good for patients in a physician-patient encounter. It's not good in any relationship. Having the ability to sense the mind, the feelings, thoughts, meanings of another person, as you beautifully say, allows for resonance to be created. So when someone recognizes your internal state and communicates that to you, oh, it must be frustrating to have a cold, you see within the other that your subjective experience is at least trying to be felt and understood, and you have the experience of feeling felt, which is probably the most important interpersonal emotion we can have. Feeling felt is where you sense another person is intending to get connected and close to you, wants to respect the sovereignty of your internal experience. That is, they don't try to make you become them. And then they literally are changed by it. That's the resonance. It's this beautiful thing, feeling felt.
Dr. Siegel, I think this incredible understanding that you are helping us connect to begins with one of those key phrases that you use, which is that we learn so much from the inside out, that these are skills that we can learn, but it also comes from the way in which we look within. And I think one of the questions that I hear so often nowadays is this idea of who am I? People are on kind of these journeys of self-discovery right now with how much uncertainty there is out there. And I know this concept of who are we through our identities and experiences and self is a big piece of what you talk about through the course of your new book. And I was hoping you could take us through a little bit of that understanding of helping us to relate to who are we? What does this identity and all these experiences mean to who we are?
Absolutely. Well, the question of who we are is something that I think when we address it, it's best to explore it like it is a journey rather than a fixed endpoint or answer that we're trying to achieve. So you embrace both the idea that it's an unfolding process, more like a verb than just a noun, who we are, but also you start going, well, I'm going to come up with responses to that question that may be always emerging, always evolving, always unfolding in my life. And so for those who like a final answer, it may be a bit challenging just to say, I'm going to embrace the journey and not just be focused on the destination. Now, that being said, what I try to do in these different ways of looking at the mind is to say, can we build a view of who we are that is consistent with science, but not constrained by perhaps what scientists are saying? So, for example, when we say, who are we, you begin with the question, well, if I am, in many senses, my mind, that myself comes from my mental life of feelings and thoughts, then the beginning of that is to say, well, what is the mind? If we say, who are we? You say, well, what is the mind? You come up with a really interesting journey, which starts with a phrase that isn't often used, but it's something that is consistent with all the scientific studies of who we are, and that is energy and information flow. So flow means change. Information is a pattern of energy with symbolic value. And energy, we'll get into in a moment, but it's something that's all around you. Like, Luke, right now between you and me, it's sound waves that are shaking our eardrums and leading to electrochemical energy flow inside of our bodies, including our brains. And you say, well, we're connected, through fiber optics, and that's, light, photons are an example of energy. So relationships are based on energy flow patterns, and our mental lives even are, basically, I think, emerging from energy and information flow that's happening both in our relationships and within our bodies. So you can say that what relationships and the brain, for example, share in common is energy flow. Some of it is informational, some of it's pure blah, 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 like that energy. Mm-hmm. And here's the exciting thing. You can then say, well, if the simplest way of answering the question, who are we, is we are both conduits, like a hose, that allow energy and information to flow. Like if you go swimming in a lagoon and just feel the water against your skin and see the light passing through the water and these shimmering colors, and maybe you run into a sea turtle, you are that experience of energy flow in the lagoon. That's a conduit. But you're also a constructor. So like you have a thought, how wonderful it is right at this moment that I can be swimming in a lagoon with a sea turtle. And that thought isn't just the flow of sensation, it's a constructed mental process. So our emotions, our thinking, our beliefs, the meanings we make are constructed elements. They're both important, they're just different. Being a conduit and being a constructor are two ways of saying who we are. We are conduits and constructors of energy and information flow.
That's incredible. I'm not sure I've ever heard it quite described in that word, in that context before, of being a conduit as well as a constructor, as we begin to experience what it is that's coming into and through us in that regard. What does that, if something I very much connect to, is this idea that we are the combination of energy and information flow. What does this give us the ability to do when we think about the potential of ourselves and our lives and what it is that we can create for ourselves, the life we can create for ourselves? What does this give us the ability, the power to be able to do?
Well, this view really is an entree, it's an invitation to then say, well, if energy and information flow is somehow what the mind is about. Now we're saying it's a conduit and a constructor, which can be very useful for people to say, sometimes I want to lose myself in sensation, and sometimes I want to lose myself in thought and reflection and meaning making. They're both important, but they're just distinct. So then you say, okay, well, if that first step is like who we are as energy and information flow, conduit and constructor, the next thing is to say, well, what are we? And what comes up with what is really interesting, because you say, well, we're both fully embodied. We're not just in the brain, in the head. So that's kind of an expanded view from what we've said since the times of Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago. So then you go, okay, well, we're embodied, but we're also relational. Like anyone listening to us right now, Luke, are a part of the flow of energy and information. And then you go, well, let's name that just relational. So you go, there's relational flow of energy and information, and there's embodied flow that includes the brain. So we're not eliminating the brain, we're just widening our understanding of what the mind is. And then you go, well, hold on. If it's energy and information flow within us and between us, what is the mind in all of that? Right? So there's lots of ways of addressing that. One, you could simply say, well, the system of energy and information flow has the qualities that make it called a complex system. That's open, it's chaos capable, it's what's called nonlinear. Anyway, those are the mathematical requirements to be what's called a complex system. And in the study of complexity of complex systems, what you see is that there are things called emergent properties. So this is something that simply arises from the interaction of the elements of the system. So what we've just said is that somehow energy and information flow is within us and between us. Okay, fine. It's one system that is the skull nor the skin are a barrier for that flow. So flow is happening between us and within us. Fine, one system. And then we're saying maybe the mind is an emergent property, which science has told us exists, of energy and information flow. That's fine. So maybe feelings and thoughts and consciousness and even information that's outside of your consciousness, maybe all that is an emergent property of the flow, fine. But there's one particular emergent property that science has proven is part of our universe that's called self-organization. And when you look at the mathematics of self-organization, you see some amazing, amazing things. And Luke, I'll just ask you if this at all relates to your life, but, you know, self-organization, when it's impaired, leads to either chaos or rigidity.
Absolutely.
I know, have you experienced that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a pattern I began to notice in myself and people I was working with, and here's the only science I can find that explains the pattern. When stuff is not going so well, you become chaotic or rigid. That's one thing. In fact, every symptom of every syndrome in our diagnostic manual of mental challenges, you know, can be, the DSM can be reinterpreted as chaos or rigidity. So that's an interesting finding. Then you say, number two, what about optimal self-organization? If that's when self-organization is not working well, you go to chaos or rigidity. What about when it's going well? And here's the amazing thing. Optimal self-organization has several qualities. If you rearrange them and rename them, they spell the word FACES. Flexible, F. Adaptive, A. Coherent, which is the math term for resilient over time, C. Energized, E. And stable, S. So that's flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. This FACES flow of optimal self-organization. When I first saw that years ago, I thought, whoa, that's like an awesome definition of mental health. And then you can ask the question, how do you get optimal self-organization? And you get it through a process that's super simple. It's differentiating elements of the system and linking them. And this linkage of differentiated elements, what it does is it basically creates the FACES flow. So what we've just said is that, let's just name that integration. Integration is defined as differentiating parts of a system, like you from me, Luke, in our relationship system. We honor differences. In fact, we can even thrive on those differences. And then we make linkages through connecting, through compassionate, respectful communication. So that would be an integrated relationship you and I can have. Or in the brain, you know, you have differentiate higher areas and lower areas, you link them, or differentiated parts of the body that go up to the skull inside the brain, or left and right. There's all sorts of ways of talking about body integration. And here's the amazing thing. Every study of mental disorders of the brain, no matter the cause, are associated with impaired integration in the brain. It's an amazing finding. And then a study that just came out recently by the International Human Connectome Project in October 2015 showed every measure of well-being they could come up with had one correlate, one thing associated with it in the brain, and that was how interconnected the connectome is, which basically means this. How are the different areas, the differentiated regions of the brain connected to each other? How integrated is the brain? So we now have the following findings. Dysfunction is connected with impaired integration. Well-being is associated with integration. And now we can say how you in your life can create well-being by promoting integration where, within, and between.
Wow. So I want to ask you maybe some basics of beginning to develop that integration ability, but I want to recap a little bit of this just quickly first, because what you're describing is that when we fall out of that pattern of self-organization, chaos as well as the rigidity sounds like it's naturally going to occur because there's an interruption to the existing energy flow and information flow that's there. When a system gets disrupted and it can't flow the same way, it can't construct itself the same way, quite naturally it's got to go into some form of chaos, or it's going to try and hold the line even though the circumstances are no longer the same. So when we find that, when we are realizing that the way in which we have organized self, meaning the way we organize our lives, the way we organize, the way we feel about things, see things, perceive things, experience things, when that gets disrupted, we don't have the organized map of understanding that we used to have. And so what you're describing then is when we are able to work at this ability of integration, then we can create the linkages of things that don't seem like they're connected or they're not related or we're not sure we understand. If we develop this ability to integrate, meaning to find those linkages, to ask ourselves questions and do reflection that tie these things back together again, it's almost as if we become not just back into that self-organized, but we become self-organizing, self-learning. And the stronger we get with that, the easier we can be flexible, be adaptive, re-find our coherence, get energized, and be stable again in that environment. It's a skill, a quality we have the ability to continually develop.
Beautiful.
Excellent. So let me ask. Sorry, go ahead.
No, exactly, and I think it's beautiful how you're saying that temporary periods of chaos or rigidity are part of the norm of moving through and adapting to life. Mm-hmm. What you don't want to do is, be stuck on this bank. If well-being is like a river and integration is this central flow of harmony, you don't want to get stuck on a bank of rigidity or chaos, for days and days and months and years. Then that's a problem. But moving there temporarily is inevitable and should be welcome. And just say, okay, I'm in the process of unfolding and emerging.
And so let's just just before we wrap up, to say a little bit more about integration so if we find ourselves, any of our listeners that are out there, they're finding themselves maybe wafting between these banks of chaos as well as rigidity, and occasionally finding themselves maybe a little more stuck there than they would like to be. How is it that we can begin to better develop this ability and this quality of integration so we can find those faces, we can find that flow that we prefer to experience in our lives?
Well, there are 9 domains of integration you could explore. For example, for your listeners, they can go today to my website, drdansiegel.com, and go to something called the Wheel of Awareness. And that starts with the first domain, the domain of integration of consciousness. And so what it does is it differentiates the knowing experience of awareness from the knowns, like what you hear, what you see, things like that. And it systematically does it to then explore the nature of knowing itself, pure awareness. In some pretty amazing experiences people have described, the wheel really is this great opportunity for you to get to know yourself. So it's the first of 9 domains, I talk about them in Mindsight and in the book Mind, these ways of saying, how can I take this notion of the mind as both embodied and relational, see it as a self-organizing process that naturally, in a sense of the why of the mind, has a natural push toward integration. And when stuff gets in the way, how can I be empowered now with this knowledge, this framework, to actually create more well-being in my life? These are steps you can begin with the wheel, and then all sorts of domains unfold after that.
So it begins with that idea or that foundation of beginning with awareness, because with that awareness, the energy, the information flow that we're made up of, we can begin to understand how does it conduct itself through us, and then how do we begin to organize it, how do we begin to construct it, so that we kind of learn our patterns, as it were, and figure out what are the patterns that lead us to flow versus what are the patterns that tend to get disrupted more easily and lead us to chaos or rigidity.
Yeah, exactly. And, when you think about meaning-making and finding meaning in your life, what people have described is when they do, for example, the wheel as one example of an integrative practice, meaning starts to become clearer. It has this quality of better focus, and then starting to fall into place naturally, almost like you can get out of your own way and let integration arise. And this is kind of the beautiful thing is the initial taking on of these ideas may take energy and effort because it's new, okay, and anything new requires that. But then what's beautiful about this whole approach is that you realize once you free the mind of all its obstacles to integration, there's a natural way integration arises, and you can just enjoy the ride. You don't have to be feeling like I'm in charge of all the effort, you know. You guide the mind along in a way, you get out of your own way, and it's really so exciting when people enter this phase of well-being, because you're in a way honoring the mind as a self-organizing process. You get to live in a body for about 100 years, but you start realizing when you go to like the where and the when of mind, and you know, this I do in the book, you get this exciting experience of expanding those two things from way beyond your skull in the present moment to a sense of connection to a much wider reality.
Excellent. So I know it's time for us to wrap up, and I'd like to ask you a question that I do not normally ask, and it is certainly a big one, but it just seems like with your wealth of knowledge and experience and all of the work you've done, it just seems like a fun one to be able to ask. So obviously we're on a show called The Meaningful Way. We've talked so much about understanding ourselves and discovery of self and looking within, and all of these incredible patterns of how we get into flow and process and understand ourselves and others. I guess I'd like to ask you kind of the age-old golden question of what, with your understanding, what do you see as the meaning of life?
Well, you know, Luke, I appreciate the question, and, you know, it's interesting you ask it because, of course, I have a kind of personality where I never like to tell anyone else, even my own kids, what the truth is.
Right.
So I only say it for myself.
Excellent.
And because I talk about that very question in the book, Mind, and I said, look, you know, it's just not my style to tell people the ultimate truth. But I can tell you for myself, this journey for me has led to a response to that question that goes something like this. That, you know, as a human being who's born into a body that gets about 100 years to live, the body. The mind is not the same as the brain or even the body. It's this emergent property of energy flow. And for me, the meaning of life comes from embracing this deep interconnection, that this energy and information flow is a part of something bigger than my skull, bigger than my body. It makes me connected to other people in this deeper, richer way, and it makes me connected to nature, to Earth, in a deeper and richer way. And not only does it transcend the spatial boundaries of the skin, but when you start looking deeply at time, and in a sense, when you look at the nature of consciousness and all these exciting views of time that I discuss in Mind, the book Mind, you know, the when of the meaning of life starts to extend even beyond the 100 years that you get to live in a body. And we haven't really talked about it, but I'll just say it very briefly. For me, the meaning of life transformed when I wrote that book, because when I got deeply in touch with what energy means, which is this movement from a sea of potential through a series of probabilities into peaks of actuality. It's a hard thing to say in just one sentence without, you know, giving background on it. Let me just say this, that part of what the mind is and part of what our self is this arising from a sea of possibility into various manifestations of those possibilities into actualities. When you realize that, and when you deeply embrace that, then for me, part of the meaning of life is actually to allow those possibilities to arise that naturally try to create integration in the world. And integration would be something like, in myself, embracing things I'm not so proud of, but they're real, or embracing things I am proud of, or just embracing the fullness of myself, and I have many layers. Or interpersonal ways, it would mean thriving, not just tolerating, but thriving with the differences of individuals, the differences of ethnic groups, genders, orientations, identities, all sorts of ways where we would thrive on these differences and promote compassionate linkages as a part of interpersonal integration. And here's the thing, I'll just, kind of conclude with the meaning of life. Ultimately, this integration process between and within, when it's made visible, when you allow it to emerge in life, which is a natural product of who we are. For me, what arises from that is the meaning of life, and that is integration made visible is kindness and compassion. And so in every way, being kind and compassionate to yourself, being kind and compassionate to others, being kind and compassionate to nature, this is a way of living an integrated life. And for me, that is the meaning of life.
Dr. Siegel, I think that's absolutely beautiful, and it is so extraordinary how true that kindness and that compassion allows for the integration and connection of just so much. And I think the way in which you describe being able to observe that sea of possibility, to be able to allow, what's arising there naturally that leads you to integration. I think so many of our listeners, you guys would know this, is feeling congruent. When you feel like life is just happening together and that you're in a flow and there's congruence to who you truly are, when you allow those aspects to emerge from the sea of possibilities, I think you're starting to find your meaningful way, which I also agree. We've all got to find our own way. We've got to define that question for ourselves. So, Dr. Siegel, I want to thank you so much for your time, your insight, your wisdom on today's Meaningful Way, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Luke. It's been an honor, and thanks for your beautiful questions.
Thank you. And for everyone, I'm not going to add on to anything further than just this, which is to check out Dr. Siegel's work, check out his latest book, Mind, as well as one of his previous books, Mindsight. You can find him at drdansiegel.com. You can also find the Mindsight Institute as well online. And so with that, I wish you the best, and until next time, enjoy the journey. I want to thank you for listening to today's show. I hope you'll also check out the newly released online program, The 7-Day Shift. This is a brand new program that'll help you move from stuck to clear, connected, and in motion over the course of just 1 week. It's the culmination of a lot of these interviews that have shared insights and wisdom and practices, as well as the work that I have done with IPEC and our coach training school and community. I hope you'll check it out and benefit from it at lukeiorio.com.